Imagine a bathtub made of stone or perhaps copper. It stands in the cold chamber of a castle high in the Carpathians. And it is filled not with water, but with blood. The blood of young girls who were killed for it. In the blood sits a woman, a countess. She's no longer young, but she believes this bath will keep her young. That the blood of peasant girls who hadn't turned 20 yet will turn back the clock on her own aging flesh.
Tick, tick, down the hall. Great tales, call it by name. Great tales, shadows remain. Tick, 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 time keeps its stare. Great tales, something is there.
Nearly all of you know this image. It is one of the most famous images of horror in all of Europe. The Countess who bathes in the blood of virgins. And I tell you something right at the beginning of this episode that might surprise you. This image is an invention. It appears in not a single court record. Not a single witness ever described it. It surfaces for the first time 115 years after the death of the woman it concerns. And it comes from the pen of a man who never met her. The woman's name was Elizabeth Báthory. And her true story is more gripping, more complicated, darker, and more uncomfortable than any bathtub full of blood. Welcome back to Grey Tales. I'm Chris, and today it is time to bring a small series to a close. This is the third and final episode of the Carpathian Trilogy. In the first episode, we looked at the Strigoi, the Romanian vampire of folklore, the dead who returns. In the second episode, we covered Vlad Tepes, the real prince whom propaganda turned into a monster. And today, we close the circle with a woman, Elizabeth Báthory, in Hungarian, Báthory Erzsébet, the Blood Countess. The Guinness Book of Records lists her as the woman with the most murders in human history. 650 victims, says one legend. But, and this is why this episode is the perfect conclusion to the trilogy, with Báthory, the same question arises as with Vlad and the Strigoi, only sharper. The question is, how much of what we think we know is true, and how much is a myth, politics, and retroactive invention? I will not give you a simple answer today. I can't, because there isn't one. What I can give you is every side. The Countess as a sadist, the Countess as a victim of justice, and the long, dark road in between, where the two can no longer be cleanly separated. Make it dark, pour yourself a drink. We're climbing into the Carpathians one last time. A name like an echo. To understand Elizabeth, you first have to understand her name, Báthory. In the Carpathians of the 16th century, this name sounds like an echo. The Báthory are no ordinary noble family. They are one of the most powerful dynasties in the Kingdom of Hungary. Elizabeth's uncle, Stefan Báthory, is no less than the King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, and before that, Prince of Transylvania. Her cousin Gabor will also become Prince of Transylvania. On both sides of her family, paternal and maternal, you will find rulers, princes, generals. And here is the first thread we will pull on later. Do you remember the last episode? Vlad Tepes' allies and adversaries? There was a Stefan Báthory who fought alongside Vlad against the Ottomans in Wallachia. The same family. The Báthory have been a power player for a century and a half in the very region this trilogy has been exploring. They are not minor figures, they are principal actors. Elizabeth is born on August 7th, 1560, on a family estate near Nyírbátor in the northeast of present-day Hungary. She grows up primarily at the castle of Erzsébet. We know little about her childhood, but a few things are documented. She was highly educated. She spoke Hungarian, Latin and German fluently. Some sources add Greek and Slovak. For a woman of her time, this was extraordinary to a remarkable degree. Many male nobles, even high-ranking ones, could barely read and write. Elizabeth could do both, in several languages. And there is a medical detail that will become important later. Several sources report that as a child, she suffered from severe seizures, possibly epilepsy. In an age without neurology, without any understanding of such conditions, a child with convulsions was a child the villagers whispered about. Keep that in the back of your mind. The wedding of two realms. At about 10 or 11 years of age, Elizabeth is betrothed to Ferenc Nadasdy, the heir of another powerful Hungarian family. It is not a love match. It is a political transaction between two dynasties. There is a story I will not withhold from you, even though it is unverified. Some sources claim the young Elizabeth became pregnant before the wedding by a man of low birth, a peasant or a servant. The child was supposedly hidden, and Ferenc Nadasdy allegedly had the lover castrated and torn apart by dogs. I'll only say this: the story appears in late sources, long after Báthory's death, and it bears all the hallmarks of later myth-making. But it shows you how early people began spinning stories around this woman. What is established? On May 8, 1575, when Elizabeth is 14.5 years old, the wedding takes place at the Palace of Arano. Roughly 4,500 guests are said to have been invited. It is a wedding that joins two enormous estates: the Báthory holdings in Transylvania and the Nadasdy holdings in Royal Hungary. As a wedding gift, Elizabeth receives the castle of Kastitze in the Little Carpathians in what is now western Slovakia, along with 17 surrounding villages. One small detail tells you a great deal about Elizabeth Báthory. She refuses to take her husband's name. She remains a Báthory. The reason is simple: her rank is higher than his. The Báthory are older, more powerful, closer to the throne. It is Ferenc Nadasdy who, in many respects, married into her family, not the other way around. Ferenc is a soldier, an excellent one in fact. The Ottomans call him the Black Bey of Hungary. He's almost constantly at war, especially from 1593 onward, when the so-called Long Turkish War breaks out. And that means, for decades, Elizabeth Báthory runs, largely on her own, a vast empire of castles, villages and estates. She administrates the properties. She dispenses justice. In wartime, she organizes medical care for the peasants. In her husband's absence, she is the sole ruler of a small kingdom. And then, on January the 4th, 1604, Ferenc Nadasdy dies. An illness that had begun in his legs had been progressively paralyzing him since 1601. Elizabeth is 43 years old. She's a widow. And now she is something that in the male-dominated world of the early 17th century is dangerous. A woman who commands enormous wealth and enormous power entirely on her own. The rumors. Even during her husband's lifetime there was talk. This matters for both readings of the story. Between roughly 1602 and 1604, a Lutheran pastor named István Magyari publicly complains about the Countess. He raises accusations. Something is happening at Kastitze, something involving maidservants, something terrible. What happens next is nothing. As long as Ferenc Nadasdy is alive, the family is untouchable. A complaint against the Countess is a complaint against one of the most powerful houses in the country. But after 1604, after Ferenc's death, the rumors thicken. So what's being said? That young girls sent to Kastitze as servants do not return. That they are maidservants from the surrounding areas, peasant daughters between 10 and 14 years old that are lured into the castle with the promise of a position. That they are beaten, that they're tortured, mutilated, and that they die. And in 1609 something crucial changes. Until then, the rumors had concerned peasant girls. Now the word is out that the Countess has begun killing daughters of lesser nobility as well. Girls from families that bore their own coat of arms, that had their own voice. And this is the moment when gossip becomes a matter of politics. Because, and this is the sobering truth about the early 17th century, the deaths of peasant girls barely concerned anybody. The deaths of noble daughters concerned them greatly. The instant the alleged victims had social standing, Elizabeth Báthory became a case that could no longer be ignored. The Palatine. The man who now enters the stage is named Georgi Turzo. And you need to understand exactly who he is, because he's the key to the entire story. Turzo has been the Palatine of Hungary since 1609. That is the highest secular office in the kingdom. The king's deputy, the supreme judge, the most powerful man after the monarch himself. King Matthias II commissions him to investigate the accusations against Báthory. But Turzo is not merely the Palatine. Turzo is also And this is not a minor detail, but the crux of the matter, Elizabeth Báthory's cousin, a relative, a man who belongs to the same world of Hungarian high aristocracy, a man who knows exactly what it would mean if a Báthory were to stand before a public court. In March 1610, Thurzot dispatches 2 notaries to gather evidence. Over the following month, they interview people in the area surrounding Častice. By the end, the files will contain hundreds of witness statements. A commonly cited figure is over 300 of them. Keep that number in mind. We'll come back to it later in a critical moment. And on the evening of December 29, 1610, Thurzot himself rides to Častice. With armed men, he storms the castle. What he finds there forms the core of the prosecution's case. According to the sources, he discovers in the castle a dead girl who had been tortured to death. 2 more girls, it is said, were found still alive but severely abused. Some later accounts even claim Thurzot caught the Countess in the act. Whether that is true or was embellished can no longer be determined. Elizabeth Báthory is detained on the spot, in her own castle, and she will never be free again. The trial that wasn't. In early January 1611, in the small town of Ibiza, Thurzot's own seat, the trial begins. More precisely, 2 trials, one in Hungarian, one in Latin. And here lies the problem with the entire story. Elizabeth Báthory does not stand trial. She's not charged. She's not allowed to testify. She's not allowed to defend herself. She is not even present, although sources report she wanted to be. Thurzot refuses her. Instead, it is 4 of her servants who are charged. Ilona Jo, the nurse of Báthory's children. Dorothea Sentes, known as Dorko, a lady's maid. Janos Ujvari, known as Fisko, a young household servant. And Katarina Benica, a washerwoman who had served at the castle for 10 years. These 4 are interrogated. And they are, this is stated explicitly in the records, interrogated under torture. I need to pause here because this is the single most important methodological truth of this entire episode. A confession obtained under torture is, as evidence, practically worthless. This is not a modern, soft-hearted assessment. Intelligent jurists knew it even in the 17th century. A person under torture says what the torturers want to hear. They say it so the pain will stop. So when you read that Báthory's servants confessed she had tortured girls to death, you must always remember that confession was extracted with red-hot pincers and thumbscrews. But what do the confessions actually state? The reported numbers of victims vary dramatically. Fisko names 37, Dorothea Sentes named 36. Other statements go higher, to 50 and more. Castle staff at Savar estimated the number of bodies removed from the castle at 100 to 200. And then there is the most famous number of all, 650. This number, the number that put Elizabeth Báthory in the Guinness Book of Records, rests on a single statement. A woman, referred in the sources to as the maid Susanna, claims that a court official named Jakob Swisvali had seen a list of over 650 names in a private book belonging to the Countess. Let me take that apart for you. It is a statement about a statement. Susanna says that Swisvali said he had seen something. Swisvali himself, the supposed eyewitness, never testifies to it. He makes no mention of the book in his own testimony, not a word. And the book? The book's never found. It never surfaces. Nobody ever sees it. The perhaps most famous number in criminal history, 650 victims, is a rumor about a book that no one ever held in their hands. But I don't write this episode one-sidedly, and there's another side to the coin. Bodies were found at the castle. Dying girls were found. Multiple independent sources confirm this. And 2 court officials, Benedict de Seo and the very same Jakob Swisvali, testified that they had seen the Countess herself torture and kill maidservants. So on one side, there are the torture protocols, which are worthless. And on the other, there are physical findings and eyewitnesses, which carry considerably more weight. The verdict comes swiftly. Ilona Jo and Dorothea Sentes are sentenced to death. Before they are burned at the stake, their fingers are torn from their hands with red-hot pincers. Fischko, considered less culpable, is beheaded, his body then burned. Katharina Bennica, the washerwoman, escapes the stake. Witnesses testify that she has been bullied and dominated by the other women. She receives life imprisonment. And Elizabeth Báthory? No verdict is pronounced on her, because there is no trial against her. Before we continue, I have a small request. If you're enjoying this episode, please leave me a like, and a comment too if you feel like it. I always love hearing from you. I'd also like to invite you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. But enough about me. Back to the story. The walled-in countess. What happens to Báthory is, in its own cold way, perhaps the most disturbing thing in the entire story. King Matthias II pushes for the countess to be brought before a proper court. There are indications he even wanted her executed. But Tuzeau prevails. His argument to the king? A public trial of Báthory, a public execution of a woman from one of the most powerful families in the realm. That would be a scandal that would damage the entire Hungarian high aristocracy. If you can send a Báthory to the stake, who will still be safe? So they choose a different path. Elizabeth Báthory is imprisoned in her own castle Šastice, and multiple sources report the same terrible detail. She's walled in, confined to a set of rooms. Some sources say with the windows bricked up, only narrow slits left open, for air and for the passing through of food. She lives like this for 4 years, walled in inside her own castle. One of the most powerful women in Hungary, a woman who once ruled over 17 villages, who read in several languages and administered an empire, vanished behind a solid, mortared wall. On August 21st, 1614, Elizabeth Báthory is found dead. She is 54 years old. One detail stands out, one that I cannot get out of my head. Beside her stood several untouched plates of food, which means nobody knew exactly when she had died. She had been so completely removed from the world that even her death was only noticed after a delay. She's initially buried in the church of Šastice, but the villagers object. They do not want the beast of Šastice in their cemetery, so her body is transferred back to the Báthory homeland, to Exat. Even that is not entirely confirmed. Like so much in this story, even Elizabeth Báthory's grave is in the end uncertain. The other reading. So much for the story as it has been told for centuries. Now I turn the picture around, because since the 1980s there's been a serious counter-thesis, and you need to know it too in order to form your own judgment. In 1984, the Hungarian historian Laszlo Nagy publishes a book that triggers an avalanche. Nagy's thesis: Elizabeth Báthory was not primarily a murderer. She was the victim of political intrigue. Look at the evidence that Nagy and later researchers, such as the British author Tony Thorne, have assembled. First, the motive. As a widow, Elizabeth Báthory was the administrator of an enormous fortune. And King Matthias II, or rather the Habsburg crown, owed her late husband a large sum of money. With Ferenc Dardasti's death, that debt was passed to Elizabeth. Had Báthory been convicted of murder, her estates would have fallen to the crown, and the debt would have been conveniently erased. But as long as she was not convicted, her fortune and her claim remained intact. Second, the heirs. There are indications that Báthory's own sons-in-law and her son Paul knew of the impending arrests in advance. A conviction would have shattered the family fortune. A quiet house arrest, on the other hand, meant the estates stayed in the family. And that is exactly what happened. Because Báthory was never convicted, her property passed after her death not to the crown, but to her children. Third, religion and the grand politics. The Báthory were Protestant aristocrats. The Habsburg were Catholic and driving the Counter-Reformation forward. Elizabeth's cousin, Gábor Báthory, was Prince of Transylvania and an opponent of the Habsburgs. Elizabeth is said to have supported this cousin. A powerful, wealthy Protestant Báthory widow who was close to an anti-Habsburg prince was for the crown, simply said, a problem. Fourth, the timing. Turzo initiated steps toward Báthory's arrests almost as soon as he became Palatine. Some researchers read this to mean the plan was already in place before the investigation even began. The investigation, then, was not a search for truth. It was the procurement of justification. And fifth, look at the witness statements again. Over 300 witnesses, the standard line goes. But when scholarship examined the files more closely, it became clear. A very large number of these statements was pure hearsay. People say, it is said, I have heard. Many statements contain no concrete information whatsoever. And many of the witnesses were dependent on Turzo, subordinates of the man who was leading the investigation and had his own interest in the outcome. There's a modern British author and academic, Anushka Bailey, who goes a step further. She points out that Báthory may have taught young women to read and even have owned a printing press. For a woman of the era, these were utterly subversive activities. A woman who educated other women, who was economically and intellectually independent, who did not fit into the power structure of the kingdom. Someone like that, Bailey argues, could conveniently be pressed into the age-old mold, the woman as a monster. The birth year of the bloodbath. And now we return to the bathtub from the beginning of this episode, to the image everyone knows, the Countess who bathed in the blood of virgins. I told you in the intro, and no, I'll back it up. This image does not come from the trial. It appears in no protocol from 1611. None of the tortured servants ever spoke of the bloodbath. None of the witness statements mention it. The bloodbath appears for the first time in 1729, 115 years after Báthory's death, in a work by the Jesuit scholar Laszlo Turoczi. Turoczi writes in the spirit of the Counter-Reformation, and he embellishes the sober court case with a few decisive, freely invented details. His story goes like this. A maidservant hurt the Countess while combing her hair. The Countess struck the girl so hard that blood splattered onto Báthory's own hand. And where the blood had touched her skin appeared younger, fresher. Thereupon, Turoczi writes, the Countess decided to systematically kill young women and bathe in their blood. It is a perfect story. It has a morale, it has an image, it has a reason. It explains the monster. But by every measure of what the sources actually contain, it is entirely fabricated. Turoczi had a second motive too. He attributed the cause of Báthory's alleged madness to something that appears in no court record, her Protestant faith. Remember, the Báthory were Protestants. Turoczi was a Jesuit, a man of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. In his telling, the Blood Countess also becomes a warning against straying from the true, that is, Catholic faith. The story spreads. In 1742, the scholar Matthias Bell cites it. He's skeptical of the bloodbath detail, but by mentioning it at all, he carries it further. Later authors adopt it, embellish it. By the 19th century, the bath of rejuvenation has become the bath of a vain woman, and then the bath of a vampiric woman. It is not until 1817 that the actual witness files from the trial are published for the first time. And in them, you can probably guess, there's not a single word about a bloodbath. But by then, it is far too late. The legend is more powerful than the record. And it is precisely here, at this point, that the circle of our trilogy closes. Do you remember the Vlad Tepes? Marcus Ira and the Nuremberg pamphlet of 1488? The exact same pattern. A real person, a real case, a real cruelty perhaps. And then a printer, a scholar, a writer who comes along decades or centuries later and transforms the raw material into a monster. Vlad got his woodcut of the Forest of Stakes. Elizabeth got a bathtub full of blood. In both cases, the image the world knows to this day is not the work of witnesses, it is the work of storytellers. We don't know. We're nearing the end, and I owe you an honest reckoning now. Not a comfortable one, an honest one. Let me first say that the revisionist thesis does not prove. It does not prove Báthory's innocence. Laszlo Nagy and Tony Thorne convincingly demonstrate that there were political motives, that the trial was not a fair trial, that the 650 is a phantom number, and that the bloodbath is an invention. But the trial was manipulated is not the same as nothing happened. A politically motivated trial can still be directed at a guilty person. Both things can be true at the same time. And there remain the uncomfortable facts that cannot be explained away even by the conspiracy thesis. Dead and dying girls were found at Šastice Castle at the time of the arrest. Multiple sources confirm this, not just the torture protocols. There were the public complaints of Pastor Maggiari as early as 1602, long before any Habsburg intrigue. There were 2 court officials who testified independently of the torture that they had seen the Countess herself kill. Even if you entirely discard the worthless torture confessions and all the hearsay, a credible residue remains that demands explanation. So what actually survives when you strip away both layers, the legend of the 18th century and the conspiracy thesis of the 20th? What remains is a woman in whose household violence almost certainly prevailed. In the world of the early 17th century, physical violence against servants was commonplace and barely limited by law. A noble was legally permitted to physically discipline their household staff. The question was never whether Báthory struck her maidservants. Most people of her class did. The question is whether that everyday legal violence escalated into something excessive, a pattern of torture and killing. And the question is whether there were 10 dead or 50 or more, and whether Elizabeth Báthory was the perpetrator, an accomplice, or a woman onto whom the deeds of her own staff were projected. The honest answer is, we don't know, and we will never know for certain. The one person who could have told us the truth was never allowed to testify. She was locked behind a wall and left to die there. Elizabeth Báthory was, in the most literal sense, silenced. And that silence is the reason the storytellers afterward had such a free hand to invent their bathtub full of blood. The end of the Carpathian Trilogy. And with that, we close our Carpathian Trilogy. 3 episodes, 3 figures of horror, and if you heard all 3, then perhaps you can now see the pattern that connects them. In the first episode it was the Strigoi, a dead man who returns, a figure onto which entire villages projected their fear of plague, death and the inexplicable, a monster born of fear. In the second episode it was Blood Countess, a real prince, cruel yes, but transformed by Saxon printers, by a Hungarian king, by Russian monks, and ultimately by Hollywood into 4 different monsters at once. A monster born of politics. And today, in the third episode, it was Elizabeth Báthory, a powerful, educated, inconvenient woman in whose household something dark occurred, but who was turned into the Blood Countess by an 18th century Jesuit, a full 100 years after her death, cast into the internal image of the vain, murderous woman, a monster born of storytelling. Can you hear it? Folklore, politics, storytelling, 3 different workshops, and in each one a human being or a human fear is forged into a monster. That, I believe, is the real lesson of these 3 episodes. The monsters of the Carpathians are real, but they are not real where we expect them. They are not in the grave, not on the stake, not in the bathtub. They are in us, in our insatiable need to press the uncanny, the foreign, the powerful, the inconvenient into a simple, frightening, tellable shape. A monster is more convenient than a human being. A monster doesn't need to be understood. A monster only needs to be feared. Elizabeth Báthory died in 1614 behind a bricked-up wall. What truly happened within the walls of Šastice died with her. What survived is the bathtub, the invented image. And perhaps that is the final, quietest horror story of this trilogy. That in the end, it is not the truth that survives, but the better story. Thank you for experiencing these 3 episodes with me, from the Strigoi through the Impaler to the Countess. Sleep well, and the next time someone tries to sell you a monster, ask first who is telling the story and why. That was Great Tales. I'll see you next time. Please remember to leave a like and subscribe, and please spread the word. Take good care of yourselves. Yours, Chris.